Welcome to Sleepy Sagas, where historical figures come to entertain your sleep. Today, we're diving into the bizarre and contradictory world of Caligula, one of the most notorious emperors in Roman history. A man who was initially expected to be a fair and just ruler, but who ended up becoming infamous for his outrageous and tyrannical reign. Picture yourself as a Roman citizen in 37 AD, full of hope and optimism for a bright future under the rule of a young and promising emperor. Caligula, the son of the legendary general Germanicus, ascended the throne with immense potential. People believed that with his wisdom and leadership, he would usher in an era of peace and prosperity for the Roman Empire. But, just months into his reign, everything took an unexpected turn. Caligula, once seen as a ruler full of promise, suddenly morphed into a madman, a tyrant, someone who could order the construction of a bridge simply to ride his horse across it, or declare himself as the god Jupiter, demanding people worship him. His reign became a surreal and unpredictable spectacle, where no one knew what to expect next. It was absurd, it was unpredictable, and it left the world scratching its head wondering, who is this person? So, how did a man, initially expected to be a wise and fair ruler, descend into madness? The answer is far from simple. And to truly understand this enigma of a man, let's explore Caligula, the emperor whose madness became a legend that left everyone asking, who could possibly think up such things? Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. Caligula's early life was, to put it bluntly, a recipe for disaster, sprinkled with a touch of royal absurdity and a heavy dash of family drama. Born in 12 AD to Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, two of the Roman Empire's most celebrated figures, he was a prince among men, destined for greatness, or so the Romans thought. Germanicus, his father, was a popular general whose victories in Germania had earned him admiration and loyalty from the legions and the people. Agrippina, his mother, was the epitome of Roman virtue and ambition. Together, they were the ideal imperial power couple. But let's not kid ourselves, this wasn't your average happy Roman family. No, this was a clan with all the political intrigue, backstabbing, and power struggles you'd expect from a family in the midst of a bitter dynastic feud. You see, at the time of Caligula's birth, the Roman Empire was under the reign of Tiberius, a man whose rule could best be described as a cocktail of paranoia, cruelty, and a tendency to retire to the island of Capri to indulge in every imaginable vice. Tiberius was Caligula's great-grandfather, and while the empire may have been thriving, it was far from peaceful behind closed doors. Tiberius, despite being emperor, had made a hobby of eliminating anyone who he thought might threaten his power. If you were an ambitious Roman, you didn't just have to worry about your enemies in the Senate. Oh no, you had to watch your back within your own family too. With Tiberius being the manipulative, paranoid old man he was, the political landscape resembled something akin to a Shakespearean tragedy, with family members backstabbing one another in the most delightful ways. This made Caligula's family dynamics a bit complicated. Germanicus, Caligula's father, had a good deal of popularity, but that didn't protect him from the wrath of Tiberius. In fact, the elder emperor wasn't exactly keen on having his grandnephew growing too powerful. Tiberius was quick to accuse Germanicus of plotting against him, and although no one truly knew the full extent of these political intrigues, Germanicus was suspiciously poisoned in 19 AD while on a military campaign in the east, a death many suspected was orchestrated by Tiberius himself. Of course, Tiberius did nothing to quell these rumors. After all, keeping the empire on edge was part of his strategy. Germanicus's sudden demise left Caligula, still a boy, in a precarious position. His mother, Agrippina, became the Roman equivalent of a widow in the crosshairs of an imperial vendetta, and Caligula was thrust into a world of bitterness and ambition, not to mention political scheming. Caligula's early years were far from the quiet, pastoral childhood one might expect from a future emperor. He was, of course, surrounded by luxury and privilege. There's no denying that. But the constant threat of death loomed large, and the boy learned early on that in the halls of Roman power, family loyalty was as fragile as a Senate vote. At the age of 7, he witnessed the political machinations and backstabbing firsthand, and as he matured, his world became a playground for the manipulations of those around him. You see, Caligula wasn't just a regular kid. He was the son of a beloved general and the grandson of Augustus, the emperor who transformed the Roman Republic into an empire. The expectations placed on him were beyond comprehension. He was supposed to be the future of Rome, a shining beacon of imperial glory. But what would he grow into? A noble ruler like his father, or a power-hungry tyrant like his great-grandfather Tiberius? While Caligula was still a child, Agrippina, his mother, the ever-ambitious Roman matriarch, had plans of her own. After Germanicus's death, she wasn't about to let Tiberius steal her son's birthright without a fight. She maneuvered herself into a position of power within the imperial family, but as any seasoned politician knows, the Roman imperial court was no place for amateurs. Agrippina, although she was a skilled operator, found herself increasingly at odds with the reigning emperor. Tiberius had no love for Agrippina's family, seeing them as a threat to his own power, and in 29 AD, after a series of power struggles and suspicions about Agrippina's ambitions, she was exiled, leaving Caligula and his siblings to fend for themselves. But this wasn't just a simple exile. Tiberius, being the absolute charmer he was, had a way of making the lives of those he didn't like unbearable. Agrippina was subjected to public humiliation and forced to endure a slow, agonizing death. Caligula, meanwhile, was sent to live in the palace under the watchful eye of his great-grandfather, Tiberius, the very man who had brought his father to an early grave. Now, imagine being a young Caligula, living under the same roof as the man who had orchestrated your father's demise. The tension must have been palpable. On one hand, you had an emperor who'd conquered the known world, and on the other, a young boy who'd just witnessed his family being torn apart by imperial greed. It was in this environment that Caligula's character began to take shape, a blend of ambition, cunning, and perhaps a bit of a taste for the darker side of Roman politics. He had a front-row seat to the power plays and betrayals that shaped Rome's future. And if nothing else, he learned how to survive in the most cutthroat political environment on earth. But let's not romanticize it. While Tiberius may have been the emperor, Caligula was far from powerless. His mother, though exiled, made sure her son was in the right circles, making key alliances even as his own life hung in the balance. Caligula was not a passive observer. Oh no, he was a keen participant in the power games around him. By the time he was in his late teens, he had already been involved in a handful of plots and conspiracies, some of which may have been instigated by Tiberius himself to keep him under control. But who knows? Tiberius had a habit of throwing people into the mix without their consent, most likely, including his great-grandson. And so, as a teenager, Caligula became a willing pawn in a game far bigger than him, a game in which survival was more important than loyalty. As we moved toward his early adulthood, Caligula's situation didn't get any less ridiculous. By the time he was 25, Tiberius, whom he had been forced to call grandfather for most of his life, was dead, and the throne was up for grabs. You'd think that after being stuck under the shadow of Tiberius for so long, Caligula would have emerged as a noble and empathetic leader. Surely, after all the personal and political turmoil, he would want to show the world a different side of Roman imperial rule, right? Maybe not. It turns out that when Caligula finally ascended to the throne in 37 AD, the young emperor would prove to be far more creative in his approach to leadership than anyone had anticipated. From the moment he ascended, expectations for Caligula were at their peak. He was the son of a great general and the great-grandson of Augustus. His reign was supposed to bring stability, prosperity, and unity to the empire. The people were ready for him. The Senate, filled with dreams of a new era, was hopeful. But what they didn't anticipate was the whirlwind of unpredictability that would come with this new emperor. Rather than rising to the occasion and continuing the legacies of his predecessors, Caligula quickly revealed himself as someone far more inclined to be remembered for his peculiarities, extravagance, and dare we say madness. The hopes placed upon him were dashed within months as he began to make bizarre, often grotesque decisions. Decisions that would go down in history as some of the most infamous acts in Roman imperial lore. To sum it all up, Caligula's early life wasn't just the foundation of an emperor's rise. It was the making of a monarch destined to rewrite the very concept of what it meant to rule. With the political landscape as volatile as it was, Caligula's family dynamics, full of manipulation, betrayal, and royal bloodshed, set the stage for a reign that would be anything but ordinary. His rise to power may have been expected, but his downfall? Well, that was just a matter of time. And as it turns out, time came much sooner than anyone could have predicted. When Caligula first ascended to the throne, the people of Rome were, to put it mildly, cautiously optimistic. After decades of Tiberius's increasingly erratic and paranoid rule, a breath of fresh air was desperately needed. People were tired. The Senate was tired. The plebeians were tired. Rome had been living under a reign that made you feel like you might get executed for sneezing in the wrong direction. In short, they were yearning for a change. Enter Caligula, the fresh-faced emperor who, to everyone's delight, was barely 25 years old, filled with youth and energy and, so it seemed, ready to restore the glory of Rome and free the people from the suffocating grip of Tiberius. The early days of Caligula's reign were like a breath of air after a long, stifling winter. The Senate, which had been used to living in fear of Tiberius's whims, was practically giddy with excitement. They were optimistic, maybe even a little bit naive, that Caligula would be the breath of fresh air they had been waiting for. After all, this was a young man with a name. The son of Germanicus, the great general beloved by the people. The great-grandson of Augustus, the emperor who had turned the Roman Republic into an empire. Surely, Caligula was destined to be a just ruler who would bring prosperity, stability, and maybe even a touch of joy to the weary masses. People could dream, right? To the Senate, Caligula was a blank slate, a man who could potentially rewrite the course of Roman history. After Tiberius's paranoid reign, in which the emperor's idea of fun seemed to involve getting rid of anyone who might even remotely threaten his power, Caligula appeared to be the perfect antidote. He made promises of a new era, an era of freedom, fairness, and justice. For a while, it looked like his reign would be exactly what Rome had been hoping for. In the first few months, Caligula played the part of the benevolent ruler to perfection. He held lavish public games, showered the people with generous gifts, and made speeches that left everyone thinking they had just witnessed the next Augustus himself. Caligula's public policies during this early period were practically glowing with promises of reform and kindness. His first major act as emperor was to cancel the treason trials that had been a hallmark of Tiberius's reign. During Tiberius's rule, it wasn't just political rivals who were in danger of being accused of treason. It was practically anyone who dared to criticize the emperor. This atmosphere of fear was suffocating, and Caligula's decision to end it sent waves of relief throughout Rome. It was as if someone had opened the windows after years of stale air. The Senate, which had lived in constant fear of being denounced as traitors, finally felt that they could breathe again. The citizens of Rome, too, saw this as a sign that their emperor cared about them. They were ready to believe in the myth of Caligula as the just ruler who would lead them to greatness. For a short while, Rome was filled with hope, and that hope made the streets of the city feel a little bit warmer. But Caligula didn't stop there. He continued to woo the masses with his generosity. In an effort to gain favor with the people, he lavished them with gifts, including grain, cash, and other goodies. There were even reports of him giving money directly to the Roman plebs during festivals, and in a society where the gap between the rich and the poor could be as wide as the Colosseum itself, this gesture was not lost on the common folk. For the first time in a long while, the plebeians began to believe that their emperor was truly on their side, that Caligula might indeed be the man to break the cycle of corruption and fear that had gripped Rome for so long. In fact, the early days of Caligula's reign were so promising that some even started to refer to him as the savior of Rome. To those who were looking for a break from the madness of Tiberius's later years, Caligula seemed like the perfect leader. He seemed approachable, relatable, and more importantly, he seemed normal. The people were fed up with Tiberius's cruelty, and Caligula's early actions made him appear like the opposite. A ruler who cared about his subjects, a leader who would not rule with an iron fist, but with a fair and just hand. To seal his image as the benevolent ruler, Caligula made a bold move in his very first year. He promised to reform the tax system. The taxes under Tiberius had been nothing short of brutal, and the empire's coffers were often drained by Tiberius's endless spending on his own indulgences and military campaigns. Caligula, in contrast, promised to ease the burden on the Roman people. He promised to make sure that the tax collectors would not squeeze the common people dry. For a brief moment, it looked like Rome's financial situation might actually improve. The Senate, who had long been accustomed to serving the emperor's whims at the expense of the public, was beginning to see Caligula in a new light. Maybe, just maybe, this was the emperor who would restore Rome to its former glory. For the first few months of his reign, Caligula played the part of the perfect leader with remarkable finesse. His policies appeared to favor the public, his promises were bold and filled with hope, and for a brief moment, the empire felt like it was on the verge of a new era of prosperity and peace. Caligula's image as a fair and just ruler was solidified in the public's eyes, and his early actions painted a picture of a man who would rule with the people in mind. The first months were marked by grand public spectacles, generous handouts, and policies that seemed to put the people first. It was an image of leadership that was in stark contrast to Tiberius's paranoid, isolated rule. The Romans were living in a state of anticipation, with the hope that Caligula would be the emperor they had long been waiting for. The promise of a new golden age seemed within reach. And the Senate, bless them, were practically gushing with optimism. They began to envision an empire where they could work alongside a ruler who wasn't just some cruel despot, but someone who would listen to their advice and govern with a fair hand. And yes, that may sound a bit naive now, considering what was to come, but at the time, the Romans truly believed in the possibility of change. In their eyes, Caligula was the man who would lead them out of the darkness of Tiberius's reign and into a brighter, more prosperous future. But of course, this image of a benevolent, just ruler couldn't last. It couldn't last because the truth is, Caligula had other plans. He wasn't just playing the part of the ideal emperor. He was enjoying the game, and there was no indication that he intended to stop. At first, his public acts of generosity were nothing short of impressive. But as we all know, the more you give, the more people expect. And soon, the people weren't content with just grain and cash. They wanted more. They wanted to see Caligula follow through on his promises of reform. They wanted him to fix the empire's problems once and for all. Unfortunately for them, Caligula had no interest in actually fixing anything. It didn't take long for cracks to begin showing in the glittering facade of Caligula's reign. His earlier promises of reform quickly began to ring hollow. As the months went by, the emperor's behavior became increasingly erratic. His generosity continued, but it was no longer the grand, public gestures of goodwill. Instead, it became an exercise in vanity and self-indulgence. The promises of reform, too, started to fade into the background as Caligula became more concerned with his own image. He didn't just want to be loved by the people. He wanted to be worshipped, adored, and revered. And it was during these early months that the signs of his eventual downfall began to appear, albeit subtly. What had begun as a hopeful reign, marked by optimism and genuine promise, was about to take a turn for the bizarre. But the Romans didn't see it coming. Not yet, anyway. They were still lost in the illusion of their emperor's benevolence. Thus, Caligula's reign started with hope. Hope for a better Rome, hope for a new era, hope for a ruler who would break free from the iron grip of Tiberius. For a short while, those hopes were justified. Caligula played the part of the just emperor to perfection. His public image was one of a man who was, at least on the surface, concerned with the welfare of the people. He brought hope to the Roman citizens, and for the first time in many years, the empire seemed poised for a brighter future. But as history often teaches us, hope, no matter how genuine, can be a fleeting thing. And in Caligula's case, it would vanish as quickly as it had arrived, leaving in its wake a reign marked not by reform, but by madness. The winds of change came swiftly during Caligula's reign, and they were not the fresh, invigorating winds that the Romans had been hoping for. No, these winds were a tempest, one that ripped through the carefully constructed image of benevolent emperor like a ship crashing into a jagged rock. Caligula, for all his early promises of fairness and generosity, soon proved that his real plans for Rome involved a whole lot more extravagance, unpredictability, and cruelty than anyone could have ever imagined. What started as a reign filled with hope, prosperity, and the potential for a brighter future quickly spiraled into a chaotic disaster of irrational decisions, lavish spending, and a transformation that would turn Caligula from a golden boy into one of the most infamous tyrants in Roman history. It didn't take long for the first signs of Caligula's eccentricities to show. At first, these were small, almost amusing actions, things that made people chuckle nervously and whisper to each other. Is he serious? Caligula had an insatiable thirst for grandeur, and it wasn't long before his spending began to spiral out of control. He lavishly decorated his palaces, adorned himself in the finest silks and jewels, and threw public games that were so extravagant they could put the gods to shame. His early attempts at portraying himself as the great, benevolent emperor were soon overshadowed by his insatiable desire to be the center of attention in the most dramatic way possible. Public works, rather than serving the people, became an opportunity for Caligula to display his wealth and power. It wasn't about what was best for Rome anymore. It was about what was best for Caligula. If the people were impressed, fine, but his ego was the true focus. Then came the unpredictable actions. As time went on, Caligula's decisions seemed to grow more and more erratic. What had started as a few eccentricities soon turned into full-blown irrational behavior. One of the most infamous early signs of his shift was his obsession with building monuments to himself. Oh, sure, emperors love to build stuff, but Caligula took it to a new level. He ordered the construction of an enormous bridge that stretched over the Bay of Naples. A bridge so impractical, so absurd, that it was more of a statement of his vanity than any strategic or logistical necessity. The man, who had promised the Senate and the people that he would be a ruler for the people, instead became obsessed with creating a spectacle that would dazzle them all. According to some reports, Caligula's bridge was essentially a giant middle finger to anyone who dared to question his authority. "Look what I can do," he seemed to shout as he ordered workers to build this monument to his own grandeur, an extravagance that would make even the most ambitious of emperors scratch their heads. His goal was not utility, it was pure, unfiltered showmanship. But it wasn't just the pointless bridge building. Caligula began to act in ways that seemed to challenge not just Roman norms, but basic logic itself. He famously made his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul of Rome. Now, you might think that an emperor appointing his horse to one of the highest offices in the land is some sort of comedic exaggeration. But no, this was actually happening. Caligula's relationship with Incitatus was nothing short of absurd. According to ancient sources, the horse lived in a marble stable, wore a jeweled collar, and dined on oats mixed with gold flakes. Caligula reportedly even discussed making Incitatus a priest, because why not? At this point, logic was clearly out the window. The horse became a symbol not of royal extravagance, but of Caligula's absolute disregard for reason. His behavior was no longer about ruling an empire. It was about proving just how powerful he was by bending the rules of sanity itself. It was an early warning sign, one that was dismissed by many as a strange quirk of a young emperor with too much power and not enough to do. However, what followed would quickly prove that these early eccentricities were just the beginning of a much darker transformation. Around this time, Caligula fell seriously ill with a fever. Now, whether his illness truly played a role in the transformation that followed is a matter of historical speculation. Some argue that the fever altered his mind, pushing him into the depths of paranoia and cruelty. Others claim that Caligula was always a tyrant in the making, and that his illness merely provided an excuse for his behavior to escalate. Whatever the cause, it's undeniable that after his recovery, something snapped. The man who had once been seen as a promising ruler had now morphed into something far more sinister. Gone was the seemingly benevolent figure who had showered the people with gifts and promised reform. In his place stood a megalomaniacal ruler who reveled in cruelty and chaos. One of the first acts that truly signaled the shift in Caligula's demeanor was the execution of those close to him. Prior to his illness, Caligula had been surrounded by loyal supporters, advisors, and friends, many of whom had helped him rise to power. Yet, after his recovery, he turned on them with a vengeance. His paranoia reached new heights, and he began to execute those he had once considered allies. Perhaps most shockingly, Caligula had his own family members killed. He didn't just see them as potential threats to his power. He saw them as pawns in his game of control. His cousin, Marcus Junius Silanus, was executed on a whim, as was his brother-in-law, Lepidus. Even his own aunt, Livilla, was put to death under suspicious circumstances. These executions weren't about political necessity. They were about eliminating anyone who Caligula feared might one day challenge his authority. He became obsessed with purging his inner circle, and those who had once stood by him found themselves dragged into his web of paranoia and cruelty. Caligula was not just an emperor. He was a man who feared betrayal at every corner, and his way of dealing with that fear was to eliminate anyone who even remotely posed a threat to his power. The cruelty didn't stop with his family. Caligula's actions became more and more tyrannical, and the people who had once seen him as a savior now found themselves at the mercy of a capricious and unpredictable ruler. His policies became increasingly erratic. He imposed taxes on the people that served only to line his own pockets, spending vast amounts of money on lavish building projects and extravagant public spectacles. Meanwhile, the common people, who had once cheered for him, now found themselves living in fear. Caligula began to demand that he be worshipped as a living god, requiring the Senate to deify him and issue coins with his face on them. The Senate, once hopeful for a fair and just ruler, now cowered before his whims, unable to stop his descent into madness. His grand plans for public reform were abandoned, replaced with indulgence in personal excess. Rome, which had once seemed like it might break free from the chains of Tiberius's cruelty, was now being strangled by a new, equally terrifying tyrant. The early image of Caligula as a fair and just ruler was quickly shattered. His cruelty became notorious, and his reign was marked by acts of violence, madness, and self-glorification. The people who had once adored him now feared his wrath. His unpredictability made it impossible to anticipate what he would do next. Would he offer another public spectacle? Or would he execute someone in front of the entire Senate, just for fun? No one knew, and that was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. Caligula was no longer the man who promised to restore peace and prosperity to Rome. He had become something else entirely, a man consumed by his own desires for power, control, and recognition. His cruelty, once a faint shadow on the horizon, had now engulfed the entire empire. And with it, the hope that had once surrounded his reign was gone. In the end, it wasn't just Caligula's actions that destroyed his early image. It was his transformation into something the people couldn't recognize. They had hoped for a fair ruler. They had dreamed of an emperor who would lead them into a new age of prosperity. But what they got was a ruler who, at the first sign of weakness, turned into a tyrant who would stop at nothing to maintain his grip on power. The early days of his reign, filled with promise and optimism, were soon relegated to the past. The shift had begun, and it was only a matter of time before Rome realized that the emperor they had once adored was now a monster in their midst. If you were to ask a typical Roman citizen what they expected from their emperor, it's safe to assume that godlike behavior was not at the top of the list. And yet there he was, Caligula, with his freshly minted title and a brilliant idea. Why not just declare myself a god? Now, of course, many emperors had dipped their toes in the divine emperor pool. Augustus had laid the groundwork for emperor worship by associating himself with the gods, and Tiberius, while not exactly playing the divine card, had certainly made it clear that he was a man of immense power. But Caligula wasn't satisfied with just a little sprinkle of divinity. Oh no. He had a different idea entirely. He was going to be the whole pantheon. In one fell swoop, he announced to the Roman world that not only was he an emperor, but he was a god, and not just any god, mind you. He was embodying the mighty Jupiter himself, the king of the gods. Talk about a power trip. The idea of the emperor as a living god wasn't entirely new, but Caligula took it to a level no one had ever quite imagined. You see, Roman society had this long-standing tradition of associating the emperor with divine power, but most emperors had the decency to cloak their divinity in a bit of subtlety. Augustus had never come right out and said, "Hey guys, I'm a god, deal with it." He left that to the priests, the cults, and the imperial propaganda. But Caligula? Caligula had no such reservations. He practically demanded to be worshipped as a deity in his own right. He didn't just want the people to revere him. He wanted to be their god, their only god. To Caligula, there was no room for anyone else in the divine pantheon. If he was going to rule Rome, he was going to rule everything, including the heavens. And so, in one of his most memorable and most ridiculous proclamations, Caligula declared himself a living god. But, of course, he didn't just stop there. Why settle for being a mere mortal-turned-god when you can have all the gods wrapped up in one messy, overblown package? Caligula didn't just take on the mantle of Jupiter. He decided to embody multiple deities at once. Not only was he Jupiter, but he was also the embodiment of Apollo, Neptune, and anyone else who had any business being associated with power and glory. In Caligula's mind, if he was going to have a god complex, he was going to go all the way. And when we say all the way, we mean all the way. We're talking full-on temple construction, divine rituals, and the absolute demand for every Roman citizen to bow down and worship him. It was as if he was auditioning for the role of supreme deity of the Roman Empire, and frankly, he nailed it. No one could quite match his self-delusion, and Caligula wasn't about to let modesty stand in the way of his divine aspirations. But it wasn't enough to simply declare that he was a god. Caligula was nothing if not a showman, and as any good emperor-turned-god would do, he made sure that his divine status was reflected in every part of Roman society. Temples to Caligula sprang up across the empire, each one a gleaming monument to his ego. The emperor had temples built in his honor in Rome itself, of course, but he didn't stop there. His divine empire needed to be everywhere, so he constructed temples in every corner of the empire, demanding that the people worship him wherever they went. And because he was now the embodiment of Jupiter and other deities, It was only fitting that these temples be designed with as much grandeur as possible. It wasn't just about the architecture, it was about the spectacle. It was about ensuring that every Roman citizen knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the man on the throne wasn't just an emperor. He was a god, and they'd better treat him as such. Caligula's thirst for worship didn't end with buildings and grand structures. No, he also made sure that his daily life was nothing short of divine. He demanded that priests worship him, that sacrifices be made in his honor, and that he be adored like the gods of old. He wasn't asking for people to respect him. Oh no, he wanted devotion. He wanted the kind of fervor usually reserved for the most venerated gods in the pantheon. In Caligula's world, the line between emperor and god had been not just blurred but completely obliterated. And if anyone was foolish enough to refuse him, well, they'd be dealt with swiftly. Caligula didn't have time for subtlety, after all. This wasn't just a matter of political power, it was a matter of his divine right to rule. The idea of a ruler as a god was no longer a mere political tool. It was his truth, and anyone who questioned it was, quite simply, a heretic. As for the Senate, well, they were more than a little shocked by this new development. After all, they had spent years dealing with emperors who, while certainly fond of their power, had never quite dared to claim the title of living god. Sure, they had their divine associations, their ceremonies, and their images on coins, but they had never actually expected the emperor to ask for full-on god status. The Senate didn't know how to respond to this new Caligula. They had just gotten used to his extravagant spending and unpredictable whims. But this was next-level stuff. And because they didn't have the spine to oppose him outright, remember, this was Rome, and at this point, doing anything to upset an emperor was a good way to end up dead. They simply went along with it. They voted to make Caligula a living god, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. After all, what else could they do? Caligula was no longer just their emperor. He was a god, and defying a god tends to be a short-term proposition. So the Senate, who had hoped for a more grounded and just ruler, found themselves in the awkward position of having to officially sanction Caligula's self-deification. It was a move that would go down in history as one of the most absurd moments in Roman imperial history. And this is where things got interesting, or rather, where things started to fall apart for Caligula and the Roman Empire as a whole. His demands for worship were not just limited to religious ceremonies. No. Caligula wasn't content with just being revered at temples. He wanted the people to revere him at all times. He insisted that statues of himself be placed in temples, theaters, and even the homes of the elite. He ordered that his image be displayed everywhere, as if a reminder of his divine status were necessary at every turn. Caligula was not merely content with being worshipped in sacred spaces. He wanted to be worshipped in everyday life, on every street corner, in every private home. His name, his image, and his divine presence became inescapable. If you went to the theater, you were going to see Caligula. If you went to a temple, you were going to see Caligula. If you went to the marketplace, you could bet that you would find another statue of Caligula, because clearly, there wasn't enough Caligula in the world to satisfy him. His presence was everywhere, suffocating the very fabric of Roman life with the idea that every thought, every action, and every moment was, in some way, dedicated to him. Now, if this all sounds like a bit of a nightmare, well, you're not alone in thinking so. The more Caligula demanded worship, the more the relationship between the emperor and the people began to sour. At first, people had complied, at least outwardly, with his requests for divine recognition. It was easy enough to pay lip service to a man who was, at least publicly, still promising prosperity and stability. But as the months wore on, the constant pressure to revere him as a living god began to wear thin. People grew weary of the endless statues, the incessant demands for worship, and the sense that their emperor was more interested in his own ego than in actually ruling the empire. What was once a small indulgence, a few temples here, a couple of statues there, had ballooned into an all-consuming spectacle. Caligula wasn't just a god in name anymore. He had embedded himself into every aspect of Roman life, creating a society where his divine presence was not just expected but required. And this forced deification began to destabilize the very foundation of the emperor-people relationship. As Caligula demanded more and more worship, the cracks began to show in his carefully crafted image. His reign, which had once seemed like it might bring a new golden age to Rome, became less about the welfare of the empire and more about Caligula's personal glory. The people, once willing to grant him the benefit of the doubt, started to resent his incessant demands. They were no longer living in an empire. They were living in a cult of personality, where every move they made seemed to feed into the godlike illusion of their emperor. And the more he pushed for their devotion, the more the distance between the emperor and the people grew. Caligula's desire for absolute control over the Roman psyche didn't just make him a god, it made him a tyrant. And in the end, this need for divine worship would become one of the defining characteristics of his reign, leading to his eventual downfall. The empire that had once hailed him as a savior would soon begin to see him as a madman, a man who had lost touch with reality in his quest to be the most powerful god in Rome. If you thought that Caligula's reign couldn't get any more bizarre, you clearly hadn't seen what he had in store for the Senate. The Roman Senate, which had once been the powerhouse of Roman politics, with its haughty debates, intricate power plays, and civil discourse, well, occasionally, was about to get an upgrade, or rather a downgrade, thanks to Emperor Caligula's antics. You see, Caligula wasn't interested in the traditional power structures that had defined the Roman Republic. That was so last century. No, Caligula had bigger plans. His relationship with the Senate was not one of cooperation and mutual respect, but rather a bizarre performance art piece designed to mock the very concept of governance. And when I say mock, I mean mock, as in look how absurd these institutions are, let's have some fun with them. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well for anyone except Caligula, who was having an absolute blast. At the outset of his reign, Caligula had already shown that he wasn't particularly fond of the traditional checks and balances that came with the Senate's role. In fact, he made it abundantly clear from the very beginning that he had no interest in sharing power with anyone. His early rule had been one of lavish displays of generosity and reform, but all that sweetness soon gave way to a much more sinister approach to politics. Caligula, having ascended to the throne with expectations of prosperity and fairness, immediately set about reducing the Senate's power and influence, and he did so with a combination of cruelty, manipulation, and a penchant for cruelty veiled in absurdity. The Senate, for all its history and grandeur, was about to be whittled down to a mere spectacle in the eyes of its ruler. And that spectacle? It wasn't going to be pretty. Caligula, having secured his divine status, at least in his own mind, made it clear that he was in charge, and he was not interested in having anyone else take the reins. The Senate, once a body that had considerable authority, was swiftly relegated to the status of a puppet theater. Caligula did everything he could to reduce their power. He made a habit of summoning the Senate to meetings, only to dismiss them after a few words, or even completely ignore them while going on long tangents about whatever the hell he felt like discussing at that moment. He would go on for hours, discussing his grand plans and ideas, none of which involved the Senate actually doing anything useful. As if to rub it in, Caligula would frequently take actions without consulting the Senate at all, dismissing their advice as irrelevant. Why waste time with a bunch of old men when you were the divine emperor, after all? As his reign progressed, Caligula's relationship with the Senate deteriorated further. If he wasn't mocking them outright in private, he was undermining their authority in public. The Senate was reduced to nothing more than a rubber stamp for his decisions, a body that existed solely to nod in agreement to whatever outrageous decree he had made that day. And let's not forget the public nature of these displays. Caligula didn't just exercise his power over the Senate behind closed doors. He made sure the public knew just how little respect he had for these once proud men. After all, what was the point of having power if you couldn't flaunt it? And flaunt it he did, in the most absurd and laughable ways imaginable. But, of course, Caligula wasn't content with just ignoring the Senate and reducing its power. No, that would have been far too subtle. Instead, he took it to an entirely new level of absurdity by appointing his favorite horse, Incitatus, to a prominent political office. Yes, you read that right. Incitatus, the emperor's beloved steed, was appointed to the position of consul, or, depending on your source, senator. Caligula, in his infinite wisdom, and by that I mean his complete disregard for reality, appointed his horse to one of the highest political positions in the empire, further mocking the Senate and its dignity. To say that the appointment of a horse to the consulship was an insult to the Senate is an understatement. It was a slap in the face, a cruel and comedic demonstration of Caligula's absolute disdain for the political institution that had once held significant sway over Roman life. The story goes that Incitatus, Caligula's prized horse, had a marble stall, an ivory manger, purple blankets, because of course a horse must have the finest linens, and a golden collar. He lived better than most Roman citizens, and certainly better than most senators. But Caligula didn't stop at just appointing his horse to high office. Oh no. In addition to his consulship, Caligula made plans to have Incitatus speak at the Senate. Imagine that, an actual horse, expected to address a room full of Roman senators. Whether or not the horse ever actually delivered a speech is up for debate. Though, considering his lack of vocal cords, I'm guessing the speech was a bit of a non-event. But the mere act of appointing him was enough to humiliate the Senate beyond belief. Caligula wasn't just mocking the institution. He was obliterating it, turning it into a joke for his own amusement. The political consequences of these actions were immediate and far-reaching. The Senate, once a bastion of Roman political power, was now reduced to a circus act. Senators, who had spent their lives toiling away in the political arena, earning respect and making decisions that shaped the empire, suddenly found themselves out of a job. Not only were they sidelined, but they were publicly humiliated by a ruler who saw them as nothing more than a source of entertainment. It's safe to say that many senators didn't take kindly to the antics of their emperor. Caligula's complete dismissal of their authority, along with the farcical elevation of a horse to one of the highest political positions in Rome, deeply offended those who had once been among the most powerful men in the empire. What had once been a respected institution was now a playground for Caligula's amusement, and no one knew better than the senators themselves that their influence was slipping away, replaced by an emperor who, in their eyes, was not just a tyrant but a buffoon. But here's the thing, Caligula knew exactly what he was doing. Far from being clueless or oblivious to the consequences of his actions, he was playing a very specific game. By undermining the Senate and reducing its power, Caligula was consolidating his own authority. The more he humiliated the Senate, the more power he gained. He made sure that no one was in a position to challenge him, and anyone who dared question his actions was swiftly dealt with, either through public punishment or execution. The Senate, once a check on the power of the emperor, had been reduced to a shell of its former self. By appointing Incitatus, Caligula wasn't just making a mockery of the Senate. He was showing the world that he, and only he, was in charge. But how did the public react to all of this? Well, you'd think that the citizens of Rome would have been appalled by their emperor's antics, right? You'd think that they might have stood up and said, "Enough is enough. We demand a ruler who respects our institutions." But alas, this was Rome, where spectacle ruled the day. And if there's one thing the Romans loved, it was a good show. Caligula's mockery of the Senate and his elevation of his horse to political office were, for many, just another form of entertainment. It was absurd, yes, but it was also fascinating. They had no idea whether they should be horrified or amused, but in the end, they couldn't look away. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Tragic, yes, but also impossible to ignore. Some Romans undoubtedly disapproved of Caligula's actions, but they were powerless to stop him. The political elite had been emasculated, and the people were left watching as their emperor turned their once proud government into a circus act. For Caligula, the Senate's humiliation was part of a much larger game. He wasn't just making a political statement, he was sending a message. His message was simple: I am the state, and there is no room for anyone else in this empire but me. By reducing the Senate to a farce, Caligula was solidifying his grip on power. There was no longer any semblance of shared governance, no balance of power. Caligula had made sure that he was the undisputed ruler of Rome, with no one left to challenge him. In doing so, he turned the Roman political system into a joke, an institution so utterly corrupted by his rule that it became an embarrassing relic of a time when Rome actually cared about politics. The Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, had been humiliated, its power decimated, and its dignity obliterated. Caligula's farce, featuring his horse as consul, was not just an insult. It was the final nail in the coffin of Rome's political structure. It was a brutal reminder of just how much power one man could wield when he had no respect for the traditions and institutions that had once held the empire together. Caligula's reign was no longer about running an empire. It was about destroying the very foundations upon which that empire had been built. And the Senate? Well, they were simply the first victims in the great political farce that Caligula had created. Caligula's reign was one long, bizarre circus, a spectacle designed for his amusement and the entertainment of the public, and to solidify his already godlike ego. It wasn't enough to just rule the Roman Empire. No, Caligula wanted to make every day feel like a Roman holiday. except with him as the star of every show. His obsession with extravagant entertainment and spectacle didn't just end with temple building or his self-deification. Oh no. Caligula took this to the extreme, and one of the grandest and most infamous manifestations of this obsession was his love for gladiatorial games. To him, the games were not merely a means of entertaining the people. They were an arena in which he could flex his power, flaunt his influence, and of course, showcase his boundless sense of self-importance. It wasn't enough for Caligula to watch gladiators fight. He wanted to get in the ring himself. And that's exactly what he did many times. The gladiatorial games were an essential part of Roman life. They were a display of power, a bloodthirsty event where the people could watch the rich and powerful flex their muscles, sometimes literally, while the poor and disenfranchised fought for their lives. But when Caligula got involved, the games became something far more absurd. Forget about the noble tradition of gladiators fighting for their freedom, or the high drama of the spectacle itself. With Caligula in the ring, the games turned into a laughable farce. Not only did the emperor himself participate in the gladiatorial contests, but he did so with a level of enthusiasm that bordered on delusional. And let's be clear, Caligula didn't just sit on the sidelines with a goblet of wine like some other emperors. No, he fought. In front of thousands of spectators, he donned armor, grabbed a sword, and stepped into the arena like he was some sort of divine warrior. But here's the thing. Caligula wasn't exactly built for battle. Far from it. His physical appearance was hardly the stuff of gladiatorial legend. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the grand spectacle, the drama of the moment, and the way the people would view their emperor, as larger than life, invincible, and godlike. And so Caligula, in his boundless arrogance, would strut into the ring, sometimes battling gladiators, sometimes facing animals, and in some cases, participating in what can only be described as a pantomime of a fight. He wasn't fighting to prove anything, mind you. He wasn't interested in showing any true military skill. No, he fought to remind the people who was in charge, to make them believe in his invincibility. And if he didn't win, well, the fights were often rigged anyway, so no one ever really got to see him lose. Caligula's participation in the gladiatorial games wasn't about honor or the thrill of the fight. It was about control, about dominating the narrative, and about making sure that every single person in that arena knew just how powerful he was. It didn't matter whether it was a choreographed display or a genuine battle. What mattered was that it was him in the center of it all, in the spotlight, surrounded by blood and applause. Caligula's self-aggrandizing performances quickly became one of the trademarks of his reign. The people, as they always do in these situations, had no choice but to indulge him. They watched with a mix of awe and horror as their emperor, in all his delusional glory, participated in these increasingly bizarre and, frankly, embarrassing displays. But Caligula's obsession with spectacle didn't stop at gladiatorial games. Oh no! If you thought the emperor's bloodthirsty displays were a sideshow, you were sorely mistaken. He wanted more. He needed to prove that he was not just a man, not just an emperor, but a warrior god, a divine conqueror capable of accomplishing the unimaginable. And that's where his military exploits come into play. If you thought Caligula had reached the height of absurdity with his gladiatorial antics, his military campaigns would prove that he could always go bigger, bolder, and dumber. Take, for example, his infamous invasion of Britain. It was in many ways the perfect Caligula stunt, big, bold, and completely ridiculous. The story of his British campaign is nothing short of legendary, though it's not exactly legendary in the way one would want a military campaign to be. You see, Caligula had a very specific idea of what constituted military success. For most emperors, a campaign into foreign lands was a serious affair, meticulously planned and executed to achieve strategic objectives. But Caligula? He didn't do things by the book. He was too busy thinking about how it looked rather than what it achieved. In 40 AD, Caligula, having heard of the distant island of Britain and its potential riches, and perhaps wanting to prove something to his ever-growing audience, decided that it was time for Rome to finally conquer Britain. So he launched an invasion. But what started out as a seemingly straightforward military campaign quickly turned into a farcical affair. Instead of gathering a fleet, preparing his soldiers for battle, and formulating a coherent plan of action, Caligula decided that the best way to conquer Britain was to wait for it, invade the English Channel with his troops and collect seashells. Yes, you read that right. According to ancient accounts, Caligula led his troops to the shores of the Channel, where he commanded them to collect seashells as spoils of war. This wasn't just some minor misstep in planning. It was a complete disaster. It was a military campaign that went from "we're going to invade Britain" to "look, guys, let's collect some pretty shells and pretend this was a success." What makes this whole situation even more absurd is that Caligula didn't just lead a disastrous invasion. He made a grand public spectacle out of it. He ordered his soldiers to line up, form ranks, and attack the ocean, all while collecting seashells like they were treasures from the gods. It was as if he had turned the entire military campaign into a performance art piece. For Caligula, the only thing that mattered was the visual impact. It didn't matter that nothing had been accomplished. What mattered was that he could stand there, in front of his soldiers, and show them that he was their mighty commander who had the entire empire at his feet. And if that meant collecting a few shells while pretending to conquer Britain, well, so be it. But that wasn't the end of Caligula's military madness. No. He had more tricks up his sleeve, and his campaigns grew even more absurd. You see, Caligula wasn't interested in strategy or gaining ground. His campaigns weren't about advancing the empire. They were about advancing his image. He would send his soldiers on ridiculous missions that served no purpose other than to boost his own ego. His military exploits weren't about conquering the world. They were about conquering the hearts and minds of the people, proving to them that he was a living legend who could do whatever he wanted, no matter how absurd or irrelevant it was to the empire's actual interests. Caligula didn't need strategy. He didn't need victories. He needed spectacle. And in that, he succeeded in spades. Now, let's pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what exactly was going through Caligula's mind? Was he truly delusional, or did he simply have such a massive ego that he believed the entire Roman Empire existed to fuel his whims? It's hard to say for sure, but one thing is abundantly clear. Caligula had no real concept of what it meant to rule an empire. His military campaigns were nothing more than grand performances designed to keep the public enthralled while he fed his own self-worth. In his mind, he was the star of every show, the hero of every story. The real concerns of the empire, taxation, diplomacy, military strategy, were secondary to the spectacle he was creating. While other emperors spent their time focusing on the empire's welfare, Caligula was more interested in how it looked to be an emperor. His reign became one long performance, one that alienated the people and military alike. And yet, the absurdity of it all didn't stop with his military exploits. Caligula's whole reign, which should have been defined by the strategic expansion of the empire, was reduced to a show for the masses. His gladiatorial antics and conquests were not about creating a better Rome. They were about creating a better Caligula in the eyes of the people. What began as grand promises of reform and strength became nothing more than a series of increasingly bizarre spectacles. In the end, Caligula's military campaigns weren't about adding new territory to the Roman Empire. They were about satisfying his insatiable need for applause, his desperate need to prove that he was more than just an emperor. He was a god, and he would make sure the world knew it. If you thought Caligula's earlier antics, the gladiatorial games, the horse as consul, and the British invasion stunt, were the height of absurdity, well, brace yourself. The man was only just warming up. After solidifying his position as the self-proclaimed living god, it seemed Caligula decided that mere mortal authority simply wouldn't do. No, if you're going to be a god-king ruling the known world, you can't just settle for a few marble temples and dramatic speeches. That's child's play. If you're truly going to embody the divine, you need to control the cosmos itself. Enter Caligula's powers of a god, where the line between his delusions of grandeur and outright insanity became even more apparent, with the world around him spiraling into chaos. It's hard to say exactly what was going on in Caligula's mind during these moments. But if you didn't know any better, you might assume he thought he was auditioning for the role of supreme cosmic being. After all, what's a god to do when they've already claimed to be Jupiter and demanded temples be built in their honor? Why, naturally, they must take control of the natural world around them to truly prove their divine status. So, in classic Caligula style, he set about doing the most ridiculous thing he could imagine. He began to claim he had the power to control the very forces of nature. You see, Caligula didn't just want to be revered, he wanted to be feared, and what better way to ensure that than by taking the weather into his hands? Forget about gods of thunder and rain. Caligula was the one who would decide when it rained, when it snowed, and most importantly, when the sun rose and set. It's not entirely clear whether Caligula actually believed he could control the weather, or if he was simply having a laugh at the expense of the Roman people. Either way, he was certain that the natural world was at his beck and call, and he wasted no time in showcasing this newfound ability. The emperor would issue commands to the sky, yes, the sky, ordering the weather to behave according to his wishes. Imagine, if you will, the scene. Caligula standing at the edge of his palace, pointing a finger toward the heavens and loudly proclaiming, "Rain, stop," or "the sun, rise." And if the weather didn't cooperate, why, he'd throw a tantrum, as any self-respecting god would. It's easy to picture Caligula in his golden robes, scowling at the sky as if the clouds were his unruly servants who simply weren't pulling their weight. No one knew whether he was serious or just completely unhinged, but one thing was clear. His reign was quickly becoming less about governing and more about running a cosmic sideshow in which he was the star. And if you thought he was simply messing with the elements, think again. Caligula didn't just want to command the weather. He wanted to claim dominion over all aspects of nature. He reportedly declared that he could command the very sun to rise and set on his command. In Caligula's mind, the sun wasn't some giant flaming ball of gas in the sky. It was a cosmic clock that he could adjust to his whims, as if it were just another prop in his endless drama. The sun, to him, was his personal plaything. He could make it rise early or make it set late. Who needed the natural rhythms of the world when you had Caligula pulling the strings? And sure, the public may have had questions. Perhaps they were a little worried about the sun's uncharacteristic behavior. But they weren't about to argue with an emperor who was convinced he could make or break the universe with a flick of his fingers. If you think controlling the sun and weather was where Caligula's divine powers ended, then you clearly haven't been paying attention. This man wasn't just messing with nature. He was actively undermining the entire Roman religious system and replacing it with his own twisted version of divinity. The Romans had long respected a pantheon of gods, each with their domain. Jupiter ruled the skies, Neptune controlled the seas, and Mars was the god of war. But Caligula wasn't content with these established divinities. No, he wanted to be them. In his mind, not only was he a god, but he was every god rolled into one almighty, power-hungry package. Jupiter, Apollo, and Neptune? All of them had nothing on Caligula. The emperor decided that the traditional gods of Rome could take a back seat while he drove the chariot of divinity. After all, he had the real power, right? In his eyes, the established gods were just part of a long, outdated tradition, and he wasn't about to play by those rules. He even went so far as to undermine the role of priests and other religious figures in Rome, replacing them with people who would be more likely to worship him as the supreme being. Caligula took great joy in inserting himself into religious rituals, making sure that the worship of the old gods was gradually replaced by worship of his own persona. He didn't just want temples and sacrifices in his name. He wanted worship in the most personal way imaginable. In Caligula's world, gods weren't distant, abstract beings. They were right there in the flesh, him in particular. So why bother with the old ways when you could bypass the gods entirely and just make yourself the focus of every prayer, sacrifice, and ritual? If the people wanted to pray to a god, Caligula reasoned, they may as well pray to him directly. After all, why waste time with lesser gods when you had Caligula, the living god at your service? Perhaps the most bizarre of his divine demands was his insistence that the Roman people view him not only as a god, but as a personal god. In this twisted version of reality, it wasn't just about paying homage in a temple or offering sacrifices from a distance. No, Caligula expected his subjects to feel his divine presence in their everyday lives. He wanted them to feel as if he, and he alone, was the center of their world, a world that revolved around his whims, desires, and insane delusions. To that end, he not only demanded that his image be displayed everywhere, but insisted that people refer to him as Lord and God in their daily interactions. Imagine going to the market in ancient Rome and hearing someone address their emperor as the Almighty. Not out of respect, but because Caligula demanded it. This wasn't just about political control. It was about complete and utter domination of every facet of Roman life. And if anyone dared step out of line, well, they'd quickly find themselves on the receiving end of the emperor's wrath. After all, what's a god without a little divine retribution? Of course, the sheer ridiculousness of these demands was not lost on everyone. While some Romans may have pretended to go along with it for fear of angering their ruler, others were more skeptical, wondering if they were witnessing the unraveling of their empire at the hands of a madman. Caligula's religious overreach didn't just undermine traditional practices. It completely warped them into something grotesque and egotistical. The divine power he sought wasn't about creating order or bringing prosperity to Rome. It was about building a cult of personality around himself and ensuring that no one dared question his godlike status. The notion that an emperor could be both ruler and deity was not entirely new in Roman history, but Caligula's take on it was something entirely different. He didn't just want divine reverence, he wanted complete submission. His arrogance knew no bounds, and his ability to warp religion to suit his needs was just one more piece of the empire he'd bent to his will. At this point, it wasn't just the Romans who were losing their grip on reality. It was Caligula himself. His delusions of grandeur were so far-reaching that the traditional boundaries between emperor and god, ruler and citizen, became completely blurred. The people of Rome, once proud of their powerful empire, now found themselves living in a state of constant fear and confusion. Was their emperor truly a god, or was he simply a madman with too much power? Either way, one thing was certain. The balance between the ruler and the ruled had been irreparably shifted. Caligula's reign had gone from a brief moment of hope and optimism to an era of absurdity, where the emperor's desires were law, and his divine powers were only limited by his own imagination. In the end, Caligula's demand for divine worship, coupled with his increasingly insane behavior, became the defining characteristic of his reign. While other emperors had been content to rule with power, Caligula decided that he would rule with divinity. The result was a mixture of spectacle, ego, and delusion that quickly alienated the people of Rome and set the stage for his inevitable downfall. He wasn't just a ruler anymore. He was a living god, an emperor whose insanity was so grand, so all-encompassing, that it would ultimately become his undoing. And as the empire watched its emperor collapse into madness, one thing became clear. When you make yourself the center of the universe has a nasty habit of crumbling around you. By now, Caligula's reign was no longer a story of extravagant theatrics and divine delusions. It had morphed into something far darker, an empire teetering on the edge of madness, led by a ruler whose lust for power had long since crossed into cruelty. In the early days of his reign, Caligula had won the adoration of the Roman public with promises of fairness and generosity, but soon after his rise to power, it became clear that he was anything but benevolent. His insatiable hunger for control drove him to commit acts of violence so extreme, so barbaric, that they would forever tarnish his legacy. Whether it was the execution of his enemies, the violent purging of his own family members, or the terrifying atmosphere of paranoia that gripped his court, Caligula's cruelty knew no bounds. He wasn't just a ruler who wanted power, he was a ruler who would stop at nothing to maintain it, even if it meant turning his empire into a living nightmare. In the early days, Caligula's violence was subtle, almost imperceptible to those around him. But like a dam slowly filling with water, his brutality began to build until it exploded in a series of horrifying actions. His court, once a place of Roman grandeur and civility, was soon overtaken by an undercurrent of fear. Caligula's paranoia had begun to spread like an infection, seeping into every corner of the empire's political and social structures. He could trust no one. Not his senators, not his generals, not even his family. The man who had once been adored by the public for his charm and promises of reform was now a tyrant whose cruelty knew no limits. His reign had gone from the promise of divine rule to a never-ending saga of terror. One of Caligula's most notorious acts of violence was his habit of executing anyone who even remotely posed a threat to his authority. Caligula's list of enemies was long. So long, in fact, that it often seemed like the emperor had a personal vendetta against half the Roman Empire. His first major purge came when he began systematically eliminating political rivals within the Senate, soldiers who had once been loyal to his family, and even innocent bystanders who merely stood too close to the wrong person. It wasn't enough to simply exile or imprison those he distrusted. No, Caligula made sure to send a message. Those who crossed him, whether they were suspected traitors or just unfortunate enough to have incurred his wrath, found themselves facing violent executions that were as public as they were brutal. Caligula didn't just have them killed in secret. Oh no, he wanted to make sure everyone knew the price of disobedience. Executions were carried out in broad daylight, often involving grotesque public displays meant to send shockwaves through the empire. He wasn't merely punishing the guilty, he was terrorizing the innocent, creating an atmosphere where even a whispered word could mean your death. As if that weren't enough, Caligula also took a sadistic pleasure in watching the executions unfold. He would often participate in the planning of these brutal killings, relishing in the control he had over life and death. It was reported that he took particular delight in seeing the tortured faces of those who had been condemned, sometimes even attending executions just for the entertainment value. For a ruler who had once been hailed as a savior, this sudden descent into bloodlust was shocking to the Roman people. Caligula's cruelty wasn't motivated by politics or strategy. No, his acts of violence were about power. He wanted to control everything, from the weather to the lives of those around him. By executing his enemies in the most gruesome and public ways imaginable, he was reinforcing his authority, reminding the people that he was the one who held the ultimate power. But as Caligula's paranoia deepened, his circle of enemies began to include those who were closest to him. In an empire where political power was often passed down through family, it was only natural for Caligula to be surrounded by relatives who might one day challenge his authority. But Caligula, ever suspicious, decided that even family members could not be trusted. He didn't just eliminate political opponents, he murdered his own kin, including cousins, uncles, and even siblings. His own family was not safe from his wrath. If they had even a hint of ambition, or were suspected of plotting against him, they were swiftly dispatched with all the violence and cruelty Caligula could muster. His cousin Marcus Junius Silanus was executed, as was his brother-in-law Lepidus. But perhaps the most tragic of all his family murders was the death of his own sister, Julia Livilla. Julia had been close to Caligula early in his reign, but as the emperor's paranoia grew, so did his distrust of her. She was accused of plotting against him, a claim that was probably entirely fabricated. And in typical Caligula fashion, she was executed with the same ruthless brutality he had shown to everyone else who he deemed a threat. These executions were not just about eliminating rivals. They were about creating an empire of fear where loyalty was obtained not through respect or admiration, but through absolute terror. Caligula's court was a place of constant anxiety and suspicion. No one could be sure who would be next on the chopping block. Everyone was a potential enemy, a potential threat to the emperor's fragile grasp on power. Even those closest to him were not exempt. At any moment, anyone could fall from favor and be marked for death. This atmosphere of fear and paranoia made it nearly impossible for anyone in Caligula's court to be truly loyal to him. How could they be, when they knew that at any moment they could be accused of plotting against the emperor and dragged off to be executed? Trust was a commodity that had long since been lost in the halls of Caligula's palace, replaced by a constant undercurrent of suspicion that poisoned every interaction. And it wasn't just the senators or his family members who were targeted. Caligula's paranoia extended to anyone who crossed his path, no matter how innocuous the interaction. He would have people put to death for the most trivial of reasons, from perceived insults to minor slights. He once had a man executed for laughing at him, and another for having the audacity to look at him the wrong way. It was clear that Caligula's cruelty wasn't bound by logic or reason. It was driven by an insatiable need to demonstrate his power and to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat, real or imagined. His reign was a living nightmare, where violence was the currency of power, and no one, not even the emperor's closest allies, was safe from his wrath. This constant fear and paranoia created a court in which no one was willing to speak out or challenge Caligula's increasingly erratic behavior. Anyone who voiced opposition or questioned his decisions would quickly find themselves labeled a traitor and punished accordingly. And it wasn't just the people who were subjected to his cruelty. Even the military generals who had once served him loyally were not immune to his violent tendencies. Caligula's army, which had been instrumental in his rise to power, soon found itself under his thumb in ways that went beyond military discipline. Generals and soldiers alike were executed at the whim of the emperor, and any sign of rebellion, real or imagined, was swiftly crushed. Caligula's brutality, however, was not only about maintaining power, it was about solidifying it. Every act of violence, every execution, was a reminder to the people of Rome that Caligula was in complete control. He was the supreme ruler, the only one who had the right to live and die at his whim. In his eyes, his power was not just political, it was divine. His authority was absolute, and anyone who dared defy him, no matter how small the infraction, would face the full force of his wrath. His cruelty wasn't a side effect of his power, it was the point. He wanted to instill fear into the hearts of every Roman citizen, making sure they knew that their lives were completely in his hands. If they crossed him, they would pay the ultimate price. The brutality of Caligula's tyranny destroyed the very fabric of Roman society. Where once the empire had prided itself on a system of governance that balanced power between the emperor, the senate, and the people, Caligula's reign upended that balance entirely. Trust was replaced by fear, respect by terror, and loyalty by obedience through force. Caligula didn't just rule Rome. He crushed it under the weight of his own paranoia and cruelty. His family, his friends, his soldiers, none of them were safe from his wrath. The emperor who had once promised a better, more prosperous Rome had turned it into a kingdom of fear and bloodshed. His reign, though short, left scars that would take years to heal. And though Caligula would eventually meet his own brutal end at the hands of his own guards, the legacy of his cruelty would live on in the minds of the Romans for generations to come. In the end, Caligula's brutality was not just about maintaining power. It was about proving, to himself and to everyone else, that he was untouchable. The tyrant who believed himself to be a living god, capable of controlling the weather, the sun, and the lives of his subjects, was, in reality, a man so consumed by paranoia and cruelty that he was willing to destroy everything around him to preserve his fragile ego. The empire that had once thrived under the reigns of wise emperors was now in tatters, destroyed by the whims of a madman. Caligula's reign was a warning. Absolute power, unchecked by reason or morality, can quickly devolve into tyranny, and the results are always disastrous for those who fall under its shadow. If there's one thing Caligula didn't lack, it was a flair for the extravagant. His reign was a whirlwind of excess, a period in Roman history where the emperor, now fully convinced of his divine status, indulged in every possible whim and desire. Forget about the normal concerns of empire building or governance. Those were mere distractions from the real priorities: food, wine, sex, and spectacle. As emperor, Caligula had discovered the fine art of self-indulgence, and if he could afford to do something over the top, rest assured he would. In fact, he would do it with such zeal and enthusiasm that it almost became an Olympic event. Whether it was hosting decadent feasts, engaging in orgies of legendary proportions, or embarking on monumental construction projects that served no real purpose except to showcase his wealth, Caligula's obsession with excess drained not only the Roman treasury, but any sense of decorum or restraint that might have existed in the empire. Let's start with the feasts. Caligula wasn't just a man who enjoyed a nice dinner. He was a connoisseur of excessive dining experiences. We're talking about indulgent banquets that lasted for hours, with more food than the average Roman could dream of in a lifetime. These weren't your average Roman feasts where you'd munch on some roasted meats and sip a bit of wine. No, Caligula's feasts were legendary for their ridiculousness. He would have every type of delicacy imaginable brought to the table: birds, fish, fruits, nuts, and of course, exotic imports from all corners of the empire. And we're not talking about small portions here. Oh no, Caligula made sure that every guest at his table was drowned in food. So much so that the very idea of hunger became a laughable concept. But the food wasn't just for sustenance. No, it was part of the show, part of the performance. Guests were often treated to ridiculous, over-the-top displays of abundance, with entire animals roasted and served whole, sometimes with their insides replaced by other delicacies. You could hardly turn around without tripping over a giant feast. Caligula's appetite for food was matched only by his need to display his power through consumption. It was no longer just about eating. It was about showcasing how much he could afford to waste, how much food he could throw at his guests, and how much excess he could pile up in front of him before it all became too much to bear. And of course, at these feasts, no expense was spared, and no behavior was too scandalous. The emperor wasn't just hosting dinner parties. He was hosting extravaganzas, where decadence and indulgence reached levels that would make even the wealthiest Roman nobles blush. As for the entertainment at these feasts, well, if food alone didn't dazzle the guests, then the orgies surely did. And Caligula didn't just dabble in these indulgences. He threw himself into them with the enthusiasm of a man who had just discovered the greatest pleasure on earth. Rome, of course, had a reputation for decadence and indulgence, but Caligula took things to the next level. He didn't simply enjoy orgies, he organized them, elaborate, public orgies that went beyond what even the most libertine of Roman emperors might have considered normal. For Caligula, orgies weren't just about sex, they were about power, domination, and spectacle. They were public displays of his ability to get whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, and with whomever he wanted. These orgies became a way for the emperor to assert his control over the nobility. making them partake in activities so outlandish, so depraved, that they were bound to either comply with his every whim or face his wrath. Caligula's orgies weren't just about satisfying his own desires. They were about humiliating the elites, making them bend to his will, and showing everyone in attendance just how much control he had over them. There was no room for morality or modesty in Caligula's court. When he felt like indulging in the most outrageous behaviors, it was done openly and without shame. The lines between public and private were obliterated, and for Caligula, this complete abandonment of societal norms was not just his right, it was his privilege as a living god. His depravity was an expression of his absolute power over the Roman elite, and he made sure they knew it every time they entered his presence. But of course, food and orgies were just the beginning of Caligula's search for excess. As emperor, he wasn't just interested in feasting and fornication. He also had an insatiable desire to display his wealth through lavish construction projects that left the empire's coffers nearly bankrupt. Caligula's spending on public works was not driven by any desire to benefit the empire or its citizens. It was about constructing monuments to himself. What better way to assert his power than to build massive palaces and monuments that would remind every Roman citizen just how important he was? Caligula, whose ego was larger than the empire itself, poured vast amounts of the empire's resources into these projects, and the results were, well, let's just say they were more about showing off than about actually achieving anything of substance. One of his most famous and ridiculous projects was the construction of his floating palace. Yes, you read that right. Caligula decided that the Tiber River was far too boring, and what the empire really needed was a massive, opulent palace that could float on the river's surface. This wasn't just some luxurious houseboat. It was a full-on palace, complete with marble floors, gardens, and fountains. It was meant to display Caligula's wealth and demonstrate that he could have whatever he wanted, wherever he wanted it. Of course, this ridiculous floating palace wasn't just about the water. It was about power, about making a statement. The project drained resources from the empire at a time when Rome could ill afford such extravagance. And when the palace was finished, did it help the empire? Did it boost morale? Did it make life better for the people of Rome? Of course not. It was a ridiculous display of excess and vanity, and when it was done, it only served as another reminder of Caligula's unrestrained self-indulgence. But Caligula didn't stop there. He was on a mission to build a personal empire of opulence, and so he commissioned other grand projects, all aimed at displaying his wealth and taste. He began building massive amphitheaters, columns, and temples to himself, all intended to reinforce his image as a god among men. The public works were endless, not because Rome needed them, but because Caligula needed them. And let's not even get started on the immense drain these projects put on the empire's resources. While the emperor was busy building floating palaces and monuments to his own greatness, the Roman economy was slowly being bled dry. Money that could have been spent on military campaigns, infrastructure, or public services was instead funneled into these pointless extravagances. The Roman people, who had once enjoyed the stability and prosperity of a well-run empire, now found themselves on the brink of financial ruin. Taxes were raised, grain supplies were dwindling, and public works outside of Caligula's personal palace projects were neglected. But none of this mattered to Caligula, because he wasn't interested in building a prosperous empire. He was interested in building his empire, one that reflected his boundless ego and insatiable need for admiration. Every marble column and every gold-plated wall was just another way for him to say, "Look at me, I am God." The people, meanwhile, were left to foot the bill for his decadence, and their complaints were met with nothing but contempt. The drain on Rome's resources wasn't limited to construction projects either. Caligula's personal indulgences were endless. He spared no expense on his wardrobe, jewelry, and personal luxuries. The emperor was said to have spent outrageous sums on lavish clothing, including garments made of the finest silk, and he adorned himself with pearls and gold at every opportunity. His personal wealth, accumulated through the plundering of the empire's resources, was spent without a second thought. Caligula's vanity extended to every part of his life, and no expense was too great for the emperor who saw himself as a living god. His lifestyle was a direct contrast to the humble beginnings of many Roman emperors who had come from relatively modest backgrounds. But Caligula had no such constraints. His indulgence was boundless, and his excessiveness became a hallmark of his reign. Every luxury he could afford, he pursued. Every vice he could indulge in, he indulged. And Rome, the once proud empire, was left to pick up the pieces. This all-consuming indulgence, this obsession with wealth and excess, was Caligula's ultimate downfall. While he partied, built palaces, and lived in a world of self-created opulence, the people of Rome were suffering. The empire's resources were drained to support his lavish lifestyle, leaving little for the common citizen. The military, the Senate, and the public all began to grow increasingly dissatisfied with the emperor's behavior. But by the time they did, it was too late. Caligula had made sure that anyone who opposed him, or even remotely challenged his rule, was swiftly silenced. His reign became a grotesque parody of imperial power, one that drained the lifeblood of Rome while fueling his endless quest for self-gratification. In the end, Caligula's obsession with excess wasn't just a personal failing, it was a political one. His inability to govern with any sense of restraint or responsibility ultimately led to the empire's ruin. Rome, once a beacon of power and prosperity, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, all because one man couldn't resist the siren call of indulgence. Caligula's decadence left the empire gasping for air, and when he was finally assassinated, it was not just the end of a madman's reign. It was the end of an era defined by unchecked excess. The memory of his indulgence would linger long after his death, a reminder that power, when abused, can lead to the ruin of everything it was meant to protect. As Caligula's reign progressed, it quickly became evident that the man who had once been hailed as a beacon of hope for Rome was slowly transforming into a paranoid, delusional tyrant. What began as a confident, if eccentric, emperor gradually morphed into someone whose every decision seemed to be fueled by suspicion, distrust, and a growing fear of betrayal. It wasn't that Caligula had enemies at first, he created them. His paranoia didn't just grow, it festered, spreading like a virus until every person around him, from the high-ranking senators to his own family, became a potential threat. At the beginning of his reign, Caligula had been the toast of the empire. His early actions were filled with promise, and for a brief period, he was adored by the people. But as time wore on, his view of the world grew darker, his sense of self-importance more exaggerated. It wasn't just about ruling an empire anymore, it was about controlling every aspect of it, down to the smallest detail. And in order to do that, Caligula had to be the only one in control. The idea that anyone else, whether they were senators, generals, or even close friends, could wield any influence was anathema to him. Caligula's rise to absolute power had been quick, but maintaining it required an ever-tightening grip on those around him. And as his paranoia grew, so too did his fear of betrayal. This fear, born from an unshakable belief that there were constant plots against him, began to shape every action Caligula took. He no longer trusted his closest allies, people who had helped him rise to power in the first place, because in his eyes, everyone was a potential threat. If someone was loyal to him, then they were likely conspiring to use that loyalty as a means of usurping his power. If they weren't loyal to him, well, that was an obvious threat that had to be dealt with, and swiftly. He began to suspect everyone in his inner circle, family, friends, colleagues, of betrayal, no matter how small the transgression. A word here, a glance there, and suddenly, you were marked as a potential traitor. And as history shows, once someone is branded a traitor by Caligula, their fate is sealed. This creeping paranoia didn't just affect Caligula's personal relationships. It began to infect the very core of Roman governance. The Senate, once a place of political debate and decision-making, became a den of suspicion. Caligula's early years as emperor had been marked by his desire to co-rule with the Senate, but that was a short-lived phase. The Senate's role in Roman governance had been critical, but Caligula's distrust of these elected officials grew quickly. He saw them as rivals, as people who could one day take his throne. So, instead of relying on the Senate for support, he began to undermine them at every turn. Senate meetings became less about policy and more about posturing, with Caligula turning every word and action into a personal affront. If a senator disagreed with him, it was no longer a difference of opinion, it was an act of treason. If they questioned his authority, they were out to get him. And if they looked at him the wrong way, well, that was grounds for execution. The result of this paranoia was a government in complete chaos. The Senate, once proud and powerful, was reduced to nothing more than a ceremonial body. Its members increasingly afraid to speak their minds or make decisions that could anger the emperor. No one dared to challenge Caligula openly, because doing so could mean their death. There was no longer any meaningful dialogue in the Senate. only sycophantic praise for the emperor and nervous glances between those who knew that any misstep could cost them their lives. Caligula's distrust of the Senate grew so intense that he began to surround himself with a personal guard, handpicked for their unwavering loyalty to him. In his mind, the Senate was a place of traitors, a gathering of conspirators all too eager to strip him of his power. So, instead of consulting with the Senate, he simply bypassed them altogether. This shift wasn't just a minor change in political style. It was the beginning of a reign of terror, one in which fear, not reason, ruled the day. And it wasn't just the Senate that felt the heat of Caligula's growing paranoia. The military, once a reliable source of strength and loyalty for the emperor, also found itself caught in his web of suspicion. Rome's legions had helped Caligula secure his position, but the emperor's relationship with his military leaders became increasingly fraught. His fear of being overthrown led him to believe that the army, too, could turn on him. After all, soldiers had a long history of declaring their own emperors, and in Caligula's fevered mind, that made every general a potential rival. His fear of a military coup prompted him to take measures that would ensure his total control over the army. But these measures were often extreme and deeply divisive. To make sure that the army's loyalty was beyond question, Caligula began to promote officers based on loyalty rather than competence, creating a situation where the military leadership was filled with yes-men who were more concerned with pleasing the emperor than with ensuring Rome's safety or stability. These promotions weren't based on merit. They were based on an obsessive need to surround himself with people who wouldn't challenge him. Those who questioned Caligula's increasingly erratic decisions were either removed from their posts or executed, while those who flattered him to excess were rewarded with power. The result was an army that was, in the eyes of many, less effective and more disorganized than it had been under previous emperors. Instead of maintaining a military force that was prepared to defend the empire, Caligula had created an army of sycophants whose sole mission was to keep him in power. And yet, despite this tight grip on the military, Caligula never truly felt safe. Every soldier was a potential threat, every officer a possible betrayer. The tension between him and his military leadership only grew as the years wore on, and his reign began to take on an air of constant crisis. Caligula's obsession with maintaining control of his army, and his paranoid fear that someone within it was planning his downfall, made the military no longer a symbol of Roman power, but a powder keg of tension and mistrust. Beyond the Senate and the military, Caligula's paranoia also turned his own inner circle into a battlefield of suspicion. His family, those who had once been close allies and confidants, now found themselves walking on eggshells. Caligula's relationships with his family had always been complicated, but as his paranoia deepened, they became outright toxic. He started to suspect even his own relatives of plotting against him, and no one was spared from the web of distrust he wove around them. His own sister, Julia Livilla, for example, was initially a close ally, but as his suspicion grew, he began to see her as a potential threat. In Caligula's fevered mind, anyone close to him could be planning to take his throne, so he did what he had done to countless others. He had her executed. This wasn't an isolated incident. Family members who had once been dear to him found themselves in the firing line of his paranoia. The sense of safety that should have come with being part of the royal family evaporated under Caligula's rule. The emperor's insane belief that every person around him was plotting against him, his closest allies, his friends, and his own flesh and blood, transformed the court into a place where nobody felt safe. In this environment, even the slightest misstep could lead to a brutal death. A whispered word here, a raised eyebrow there, and suddenly, you were a traitor. Caligula didn't just execute his political enemies. He executed anyone who might possibly become an enemy. And the more he trusted no one, the more his power became unstable. He surrounded himself with people who were terrified of him, people who had learned to survive by becoming his biggest supporters, but who could never fully trust him. This created an environment where loyalty was built on fear, not respect, and where even the smallest mistake could lead to death. The emperor's paranoia fueled this cycle of suspicion and betrayal, leaving no one truly safe. By the end of his reign, Caligula's empire had become a house of cards, built on a foundation of mistrust and fear. His isolation had reached its peak. The man who once walked among his people as their hero now lived in a constant state of fear, surrounded by a handful of sycophants who were more concerned with saving their own skins than with actually supporting him. Every person around him, whether senator, soldier, or family member, had to walk a delicate line, appearing loyal enough to avoid the emperor's wrath, but never too loyal, lest they be accused of plotting against him. The empire had become a kingdom of suspicion, and Caligula's paranoia was the glue that held it all together, ensuring that no one dared challenge him, and no one could breathe freely for fear of being accused of treason. In the end, Caligula's reign was a tragic illustration of how power, when coupled with paranoia, can corrupt even the most promising of leaders. What had started as a moment of hope for Rome quickly degenerated into a nightmare of suspicion, violence, and fear. Caligula's increasing isolation, both politically and personally, created a tyrannical empire where loyalty meant little and fear meant everything. The emperor had made himself into a god, but in doing so, he had turned his empire into a prison, and everyone within it was a potential prisoner. It was only a matter of time before the walls began to close in. And when they did, Caligula's reign ended as it had been lived, in violence, fear, and tragedy. By now, Caligula's reign had become a circus of self-indulgence, paranoia, and violence, so much so that even the most loyal Romans had started to ask, how much longer can we let this madness go on? The emperor, in his infinite wisdom, had systematically alienated every person of any real importance within the empire. The Senate, a collection of terrified yes-men who nodded along to whatever Caligula said, fearing for their lives at every turn. The Praetorian Guard, once his staunchest supporters, now they too were growing weary of their emperor's increasingly erratic behavior. And his own household, let's just say that the family Christmas card was probably a bit awkward by the end of his reign. For Caligula, the more power he accumulated, the more enemies he made, and as his paranoia deepened, the very people closest to him began plotting his downfall. It wasn't a single moment or event that set the stage for the conspiracy to remove Caligula from power. No, it was the accumulation of countless acts of cruelty, bizarre demands, and a reign that seemed to spiral further out of control with each passing day. The Senate, which had once been a vital part of Roman governance, had been reduced to a collection of fearful men who spent more time wondering if they were going to be executed than actually participating in any meaningful political debate. Caligula's relationship with the Senate had been nothing short of disastrous from the start. His early gestures toward reform and collaboration were quickly overshadowed by his brutal treatment of senators, many of whom had once been his allies. Caligula humiliated them publicly, disregarded their advice entirely, and made it abundantly clear that their role in the empire was now that of mere rubber stampers for his increasingly erratic whims. If a senator had the audacity to disagree with him, he was swiftly removed from power or, more often than not, put to death. This constant stream of executions, paired with his increasingly irrational behavior, left the Senate wondering, what was the point of even pretending that they mattered? But Caligula didn't just isolate the Senate. He alienated the Praetorian Guard as well, those elite soldiers who had once been his most loyal supporters. The Guard's role in the empire was to protect the emperor, but over time, Caligula's reckless leadership and unpredictability began to wear thin on the men who had sworn to protect him. They had watched him transform from a promising ruler into a tyrant who took perverse pleasure in humiliating others, and slowly but surely, their loyalty began to erode. They, too, saw the writing on the wall. The empire was unraveling under Caligula's reign, and the only way to restore stability was to remove him. As his behavior became more erratic and his actions more reckless, the Praetorian Guard found themselves caught between loyalty to the emperor and the practical necessity of ensuring the survival of Rome. But perhaps the most intriguing part of the plot against Caligula was the involvement of those closest to him, his own household. As the emperor's paranoia grew, so did his distrust of those around him. He had once been surrounded by loyal family members, but his increasing cruelty and suspicion turned even them into potential enemies. Caligula's treatment of his family was, to put it lightly, atrocious. He executed relatives on a whim, including his own cousin and even members of his immediate family. It wasn't just about the threat they posed. It was about the sheer unpredictability of his behavior. Who could live under a ruler who viewed every whispered word and glance as a potential act of treason? Those who had once been in Caligula's inner circle found themselves living in constant fear, wondering when their turn would come. In such a volatile environment, it's no surprise that some of Caligula's closest confidants decided that the only way out was to kill him before he turned on them. Family members, servants, and even trusted officers within his palace knew that Caligula's reign was a ticking time bomb. They had watched his mental state deteriorate, his every action fueled by paranoia and cruelty. It was only a matter of time before he targeted them next. The motivations behind the plot were clear. They had to act quickly to restore Rome to some semblance of stability. Caligula's behavior had not only destabilized the political order, but had also weakened the very foundations of Roman society. Rome had always prided itself on its traditions, its balance of power, and its reliance on rational leadership. But under Caligula, these principles had been turned upside down. The Senate, the military, and the people had all been humiliated by an emperor who cared more about his own divine status and personal indulgences than the well-being of the empire. The conspirators, many of whom had been men of high standing and influence, recognized that if Rome was to survive, they needed to remove Caligula and restore order to the empire. They saw him not just as a madman, but as a dangerous madman, whose unchecked power was a threat not only to them personally, but to the stability of Rome itself. In the days leading up to the plot, the conspirators were careful. They knew that Caligula's paranoia would make it nearly impossible for them to get close to him without being suspected. But as his reign continued to deteriorate, his enemies grew bolder. The plan was set into motion by members of the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and even those who had once been loyal to Caligula within his inner circle. It was a conspiracy born out of desperation, a last-ditch effort to remove a man who had become an uncontrollable force of destruction. The plot involved a small group of conspirators, including Cassius Chaerea, a member of the Praetorian Guard who had long been disgusted by Caligula's treatment of his officers and his increasingly erratic behavior. Chaerea, a man who had once been a loyal soldier in Caligula's service, had finally had enough. He wasn't alone. Others within the Praetorian Guard, including those who had once sworn to protect the emperor, now saw assassination as the only way forward. In the Senate, the mood was similar. Senators who had once been too afraid to speak out now began to murmur about the need to remove Caligula from power. For them, the emperor was not only a tyrant, but a sacrilege. Rome's traditions had been trampled on by this man, who saw fit to elevate himself above the gods. He had reduced the Senate to a puppet show, mocked the military, and squandered the empire's resources on his decadent lifestyle. The conspirators were motivated by a desire to restore Roman tradition, to return to the days when the emperor was a servant of the people, not a self-deified autocrat. These senators had lived through Tiberius's reign, and they had hoped that Caligula's accession to the throne would bring a new era of stability. Instead, they found themselves living in a nightmare of cruelty, paranoia, and uncontrolled hedonism. The plot to kill Caligula wasn't just about removing a mad emperor. It was about restoring the Roman Republic, or at least the ideals upon which it had once been built. Caligula's assassination became a symbol of the need to return to Roman values, to rid the empire of the tyranny that had overtaken it. But as the conspirators closed in on their target, they knew that time was running out. Caligula's actions were becoming more erratic by the day, and the tension in the air was palpable. His distrust of the Senate had reached a fever pitch, and his constant purges had left even his closest allies on edge. The conspirators knew that if they didn't act soon, they too would become victims of Caligula's wrath. So, in the fateful days leading up to the assassination, they began to prepare. It was a coordinated effort, with several key players positioned in the right places at the right time, waiting for the signal to strike. Chaerea, along with a few other officers, would be the ones to do the deed. They knew it would take just a single moment of opportunity, just one chance to rid the empire of the man who had turned it into a playground for his madness. On the fateful day of Caligula's assassination, the conspirators struck swiftly. Caligula, who had been in his usual paranoid state, never saw it coming. His life was cut short by the men who had once served him, men who had grown disillusioned with the tyrant's rule and knew that the only way to save Rome was to end his reign. The emperor was stabbed multiple times in a brutal assassination that took place within the very palace where he had once reigned supreme. His death was as violent as his life had been, a fitting end for a man whose cruelty had left a scar on the empire. The conspirators, though they had acted in the name of Roman tradition and the good of the empire, knew that their actions would have consequences. The assassination didn't restore peace. It left the empire in a state of uncertainty, with no clear successor and no clear plan for the future. But for the men who had plotted against him, it was a victory. They had rid Rome of its dangerous tyrant, and with that, they hoped to restore the ideals that had once made the empire great. Caligula's death, though quick, was the culmination of years of growing dissatisfaction, fear, and paranoia. The conspirators who took part in the plot to assassinate him were motivated by a mix of personal frustration and a desire to protect Rome from the destructive force that Caligula had become. They had witnessed the empire crumble under the weight of his rule and had decided that the only way to save it was to remove him from power. Their actions, though violent and drastic, were driven by the belief that they were restoring Rome to its former glory. But in the end, Caligula's assassination did not solve Rome's problems. Instead, it marked the beginning of another chapter in the empire's turbulent history, a history filled with uncertainty, instability, and the never-ending struggle for power. By the time Caligula's assassination finally unfolded, it was more a matter of when than if. The emperor, once hailed as a promising ruler, had transformed into a tyrant so paranoid and erratic that even his closest allies were just counting the days until he did something completely off the wall enough to justify his removal. His cruelty, his unpredictable violence, his obsession with absolute power, and his delusions of grandeur had alienated practically everyone around him, making his assassination not just inevitable, but almost a relief. The conspiracy to kill Caligula wasn't just about politics. It was about saving Rome from a madman who had turned the empire into his personal playground. And so, with that darkly satirical certainty, a group of conspirators from the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, the very institutions that had once been Caligula's pillars of power, finally took matters into their own hands. They plotted his death with the precision of a Roman tragedy. Everyone knew it was coming, but no one could stop the inevitable from happening. Caligula's assassination didn't come in a flurry of dramatic, cinematic sword fights or epic, blood-soaked showdowns. In fact, the truth is far more mundane and sinister. The conspiracy was meticulously planned and coldly executed, and it was made all the easier by Caligula's increasingly erratic behavior, which made him trust fewer and fewer people. Caligula had, by this time, made so many enemies within the Senate and the military that it was nearly impossible to find anyone who wasn't either secretly plotting against him or pretending to be loyal for fear of their own lives. The final straw for many of these men was Caligula's treatment of the Praetorian Guard, his personal security force. He had humiliated them time and time again, either by removing officers at random or by ordering them to participate in his increasingly absurd spectacles, like the infamous invasion of Britain, that ended with soldiers collecting seashells as spoils of war. The Praetorian Guard, originally his most loyal supporters, had finally decided that enough was enough. They were no longer content with protecting a tyrant. They wanted to end his reign before he could do even more damage to the empire. The plan to kill Caligula was hatched by a group of men from both the Senate and the Praetorian Guard. The conspirators were a mix of seasoned political operators, military officers, and personal attendants, all of whom had witnessed firsthand the emperor's descent into madness. Among the most notable of the plotters was Cassius Chaerea, a member of the Praetorian Guard who had long been disgusted by Caligula's behavior. Chaerea had been a loyal soldier under Tiberius, and while Tiberius had his own issues, he had at least maintained some level of order in the empire. But Caligula? Caligula had turned everything upside down, and Chaerea, like many others, could no longer sit by and watch as Rome was consumed by chaos. As a leader of the plot, Chaerea's resentment was personal. Caligula had mocked him in public for his appearance, ridiculed his military experience, and generally made it clear that he saw no value in the very people who were supposed to protect him. The plot was a well-coordinated effort that relied on the participation of several key figures, including members of the Senate who had grown disillusioned with Caligula's behavior. These senators were not merely political opponents of Caligula. They were men who had once hoped he would restore the glory of Rome, only to watch as he tore the empire apart. They had been pushed to the edge by his tyrannical rule, and they knew that if the empire was to survive, the emperor had to be removed. The conspirators knew that they had to strike quickly, before Caligula became even more unpredictable. The emperor had made enemies everywhere, but more importantly, he had made himself unbearable. So much so that even those who had once been loyal to him were now eager to see him gone. Caligula's fate, as it turned out, was sealed not just by his enemies, but by his own behavior. His own paranoia had made him distrust everyone, and it was that very paranoia that allowed the conspirators to infiltrate his inner circle. On the day of the assassination, Caligula's life came to a grim, anticlimactic end. The emperor, ever the theatrical figure, was once again strutting around in his divine grandeur, completely unaware of the plot that had been set into motion. His daily routine was much like it had been for the last several months, lavish, absurd, and completely disconnected from the needs of the empire. He entered the theater to watch a performance, a typical way for him to spend his day in front of an adoring public, but little did he know that his time had run out. Caligula was surrounded by a mix of conspirators who had been planted in his retinue. They were military officers and senators who had been preparing for this moment for months, and it was clear that the time to act had come. As Caligula took his seat, the plotters moved in. The death itself wasn't the grand spectacle one might expect from a ruler who had once considered himself a god. Instead, it was a quick, calculated affair. Chaerea, along with the others, approached Caligula and struck. The emperor, taken by surprise, was stabbed multiple times. The conspirators didn't wait for any dramatic final words. There was no long monologue or hero's death. There was only swift, brutal action. Caligula, who had spent so much of his reign surrounded by sycophants and yes-men, never had the chance to react. The very men who had once served him, those who had protected him, were now the ones ending his life. It was a fitting end for a ruler who had so thoroughly alienated those around him. The very institution that had kept him in power was now the instrument of his destruction. In the aftermath of Caligula's death, the immediate reactions were a mixture of shock, disbelief, and for some, a deep sense of relief. The people of Rome were, unsurprisingly, split in their reactions. There were those who had grown to despise the emperor's cruelty and madness, and for them, Caligula's assassination was a long-awaited deliverance. They could hardly contain their joy at the news of his death. The streets filled with people celebrating, dancing, and singing, as if they had just witnessed the fall of a tyrant rather than the murder of their emperor. It was as though the air had been cleared. Caligula, the man who had strangled the life out of Rome with his erratic whims and violent outbursts, was finally gone. To those who had suffered under his reign, the assassination was seen as a necessary evil, the only way to save the empire from further ruin. The question on everyone's lips wasn't why did he die, but why did it take so long? But not everyone saw Caligula's death as a victory. There were others in Rome, especially among the elite, who had grown accustomed to his rule, no matter how bizarre or tyrannical. These people feared the instability that would follow Caligula's assassination. Rome had been built on the idea of imperial power, and with the emperor gone, there was a void, an uncertainty about who would step in to take control. The assassination had, after all, been a carefully orchestrated plot, and now the question was whether the empire would descend into chaos, or whether a new leader would rise to fill the vacuum left by Caligula's death. The Senate, who had been complicit in the plot, now found themselves caught in the aftermath, scrambling to secure their own positions of power. The death of Caligula didn't end the empire's problems. It merely created new ones. There was no smooth transition of power, no glorious successor waiting to step into the role. Instead, there was only a shaky, uncertain future for Rome. And what of the Praetorian Guard? The very soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to Caligula were now responsible for his assassination. While many had supported the plot, some of them were hesitant, knowing that they had just played a key role in the death of their emperor. The relationship between the Guard and the new leadership was tenuous at best. The men who had once been trusted with the emperor's safety now found themselves grappling with the consequences of their actions. The military, too, felt the impact of Caligula's death. There was no clear direction, no commanding presence to rally around. Rome, in the aftermath, was left with a power vacuum, and in true Roman fashion, the result was a period of uncertainty and intrigue. Caligula's death was a bitter irony in a way. He had spent his entire reign working to make himself a living god, and in the end, it was the very people he had trusted the least, his closest allies, his protectors, who took him down. His assassination, while necessary for the stability of Rome, was the tragic end of an emperor who had begun his rule with so much potential but whose ego, cruelty, and paranoia had consumed him. His death was a reminder that even the most powerful men are not invincible, and even gods can be dethroned. For the people of Rome, the question that remained was not just who would rule next, but what kind of empire would emerge from the ashes of Caligula's reign. The assassination of Caligula, the emperor who had once fancied himself a god, was nothing short of a watershed moment in the history of the Roman Empire. His death marked the end of a reign defined by madness, cruelty, and a staggering disregard for the traditions that had made Rome great. But the aftermath of his untimely demise was hardly a clean break. Far from it, Instead, it ushered in a period of uncertainty, power struggles, and a frantic scramble for control. For the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, Caligula's death meant the removal of an unstable tyrant who had terrified everyone around him. But for Rome itself, the repercussions were far-reaching. The vacuum left by his death was filled swiftly by his uncle Claudius, who, though he had been largely overlooked during Caligula's reign, was suddenly thrust into the position of emperor. Claudius's ascension to the throne, following Caligula's assassination, was the start of a new era, but one that was not without its own set of challenges. Rome had just survived a reign of terror, and now it was faced with the challenge of rebuilding its fractured political system. At first glance, the transition from Caligula's reign to Claudius's might seem like a moment of relief, but it was more like a rebound after a toxic relationship. Caligula's death created an immediate power vacuum, but that void was not easily filled. Claudius, the man who had been dismissed by most as a mere figurehead, was suddenly hailed as emperor, largely because by comparison, he seemed like the lesser evil. While Caligula had ruled with a mix of divine delusion and unchecked violence, Claudius was at least seen as a more measured figure, someone who had been at the periphery of power and was now reluctantly thrust into its center. It was as though the empire collectively sighed and said, "Well, we may not have the best choice, but at least it's not Caligula." In the immediate aftermath of Caligula's assassination, there was a brief moment of celebration, at least in the streets, where people expressed their joy at the end of a reign that had been nothing short of a nightmare. The soldiers who had carried out the deed were hailed as heroes, and the Senate, which had been too terrified to do anything under Caligula's rule, began to act with a newfound sense of power and purpose. But the transition was not smooth, and there were those who feared what a new reign might bring. Claudius, for his part, didn't waste time trying to rebuild what had been broken. Instead, he got to work on consolidating power, quietly pushing aside those who had been involved in Caligula's murder, while attempting to make it clear that he was not to be underestimated. As for the long-term impact of Caligula's death, the legacy of his reign left an indelible mark on the Roman Empire. The reign of Caligula was a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, especially when that power is held by someone whose mental state is less than stable. While Claudius might have been a more competent ruler, his reign, much like his predecessors, was constantly overshadowed by the memory of Caligula's madness. The very fact that the Roman Empire could shift so dramatically from one ruler to the next, one a self-proclaimed god, the other a man who had been deemed unworthy of ruling, showed just how fragile the empire's political system had become. Claudius's rise was not the result of a grand political campaign or a well-orchestrated plan. It was merely the product of his relative non-threat status compared to Caligula's erratic rule. So, how does history remember Caligula? Is he seen as a madman, a tyrant, or a misunderstood figure? The answer, as it often is in history, is complicated. Most modern interpretations of Caligula's reign paint him as a madman, a dangerous, delusional emperor who became drunk on power and turned it against everyone around him. His penchant for cruelty, his obsession with self-worship, and his brutal, unpredictable acts of violence have earned him a reputation as one of the most notorious rulers in history. His reign is remembered for its absurdity, for the ludicrous acts of self-aggrandizement, like his infamous horse, Incitatus, being made a consul, and for the cruelty with which he punished any perceived betrayal, real or imagined. There is a compelling case to be made that Caligula was not only a tyrant, but also deeply unhinged. A ruler whose egomania and unchecked paranoia led to the collapse of his mental state and the empire's political stability. Yet, there are also those who view Caligula's reign with a degree of sympathy, or at least as a product of circumstances beyond his control. Some historians have argued that his reign was not merely the result of an individual's madness, but rather a reflection of the toxic environment in which he came to power. Caligula, after all, had been thrust into an impossible position, born into a world of intrigue, assassination, and betrayal. His family was riddled with corruption, and he grew up in an atmosphere where survival was the name of the game. His early years were marked by loss and political maneuvering, and his rise to power was a chaotic mix of revenge and ambition. Could Caligula's erratic behavior have been the result of the trauma he experienced growing up in such a ruthless environment? There is some merit to this argument, and indeed, it's possible that Caligula's madness was not so much a personal failing as it was a byproduct of a system that rewarded cruelty, manipulation, and power-hungry ambition. But then again, really? At some point, You have to draw the line between someone who's a victim of their circumstances and someone who enjoys being a colossal jerk. Caligula's reign wasn't just about misguided attempts to restore the empire's grandeur. It was about an emperor whose ego was so inflated that he was willing to destroy anyone and anything in his path to maintain his godlike image. If anything, the story of Caligula's reign serves as a dark cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the folly of assuming that those who are granted it will use it wisely. Caligula had the potential to be remembered as a ruler who brought reform, stability, and power to Rome. But instead, his reign became a tragic example of how power can corrupt absolutely, even to the point of complete self-destruction. Caligula's reign and his ultimate demise serve as a powerful warning about the dangers of unchecked power. His rule is often remembered as one of the most extreme cases of tyranny in Roman history, a reign that demonstrated just how dangerous it can be when one man holds absolute control and is unchecked by reason or morality. The assassination of Caligula itself was the natural conclusion to a reign built on paranoia, cruelty, and self-interest, but it also highlighted the precariousness of imperial power. In the Roman Empire, emperors were only as secure as their ability to keep control, and Caligula's inability to maintain that control, or to see his own downfall coming, was the ultimate cause of his undoing. The story of Caligula's reign is a stark reminder that even the most powerful figures in history are subject to the same human weaknesses as anyone else. His descent into madness and tyranny shows how absolute power can distort a ruler's sense of reality, turning them into a figure who is more concerned with personal glory and domination than the well-being of the empire they rule. In the end, Caligula's legacy is defined not by his potential to be a great ruler, but by his catastrophic fall into madness. And while his death may have brought a temporary respite to the people of Rome, it did little to restore the empire to the stable, reasoned government it once had. The lessons of Caligula's reign, about the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of leadership, and the consequences of arrogance, echo through history, reminding us that the worst rulers are often those who believe themselves to be above reproach. Ultimately, Caligula's legacy is a cautionary tale about the price of absolute power and the personal destruction that comes from trying to control the world around you. The empire survived his reign, but the scars left by his cruelty and delusion would linger long after his death. His reign wasn't just a chapter in Roman history, it was a warning. When a ruler thinks they are untouchable, they often forget that history has a funny way of catching up with them. The story of Caligula's reign is one that begins with hope, but quickly devolves into one of the most absurd and tyrannical episodes in Roman history. When he first ascended to the throne, the Roman Empire was poised for something different. A new leader who had the potential to be a just ruler, a figure who could provide the stability that Rome so desperately needed after the dark days of Tiberius. People looked to Caligula as a breath of fresh air, a charismatic young man who could bring about change. The public was eager for someone who would restore Rome to its former glory, and for a brief moment, Caligula played the part perfectly. He made grand promises, enacted reforms, and showed signs of being the emperor they had longed for. But that optimism was short-lived. In a matter of months, the man who was supposed to be the salvation of the empire revealed himself to be a despotic tyrant whose reign would be defined by cruelty, paranoia, and absurdity. The shift from hopeful ruler to mad dictator was as swift as it was catastrophic, and by the end of his short reign, Caligula had earned a place in history, not for any political achievements, but for his ability to plunge Rome into chaos. From his extravagant gladiatorial games to his self-deification as a living god, Caligula's reign was marked by ridiculous spectacles designed to satiate his ever-growing ego. He engaged in acts that were so absurd, appointing his horse as consul, for example, that they've become legends of Roman excess. But while his actions often bordered on the comical, the consequences were far from funny. Caligula's obsession with spectacle, his cruel purges of political enemies, and his increasingly erratic behavior alienated the very people who had helped him rise to power. His paranoia turned Rome into a powder keg of fear, where no one was safe, not even his closest allies or his own family. The result? A political system that became a laughingstock, a military that was more a tool of his own delusions than a force to be reckoned with, and an empire teetering on the brink of collapse. Caligula's reign was marked by excess, violence, and instability, all of which culminated in his assassination at the hands of those who had once sworn to protect him. But even in his death, the damage was done. His reign left an indelible mark on Rome, one that would shape the future of the empire in ways he could never have imagined. In hindsight, Caligula's reign serves as a cautionary tale, a lesson to future emperors, and perhaps to all those who wield power, about the dangers of unchecked authority. His story illustrates how easily a leader can lose touch with reality, how power can corrupt, and how a ruler's personal weaknesses can become the undoing of an entire empire. The dangers of absolute power were never clearer than they were under Caligula, who, upon ascending the throne, quickly became intoxicated by his own position. It wasn't enough for him to be emperor. He had to be everything: a god, a ruler, an invincible force. And when a ruler views themselves as above reproach, as a divine figure whose will cannot be questioned, the empire becomes nothing more than a vehicle for their ego. In Caligula's case, this was not just the road to tyranny. It was a steep, slippery slope that led straight into the abyss. His reign became a warning to all future emperors about the dangers of losing sight of reality and embracing the intoxicating allure of absolute power. And yet, there is something tragic about Caligula's story. Despite all his absurdities, there was potential for greatness. He was a ruler with the intelligence, charisma, and drive to make a real difference in the world. He could have been a reformer, a leader who restored Rome to its former glory. Instead, he squandered it all by becoming consumed with his own desires. His behavior became a mirror for the empire's darkest impulses: pride, greed, and a lust for control. His shift from hopeful ruler to despotic tyrant wasn't inevitable, but it was made possible by his unchecked ambition and the empire's failure to check his growing power. The tragedy of Caligula lies in his inability to recognize the limits of his power and the importance of moderation in leadership. A ruler who could have been great was undone by his own hubris, and in the process, he destroyed the very institutions that had enabled him to rise to the top. Ultimately, Caligula's reign serves as a cautionary tale not just for emperors, but for anyone who wields power. His story is a stark reminder that power, when unchecked, can be incredibly destructive. The temptations of absolute control, the belief that one is above reproach, and the desire to be worshipped as a deity, all of these things can erode the very foundation of leadership. History remembers Caligula not for his potential as a ruler, but for his disastrous and ultimately self-destructive behavior. His reign became a dark period in Roman history, one that served as a warning to future emperors about the importance of humility, self-control, and the dangers of pursuing unchecked power. Caligula's legacy, in the end, is defined by his brutal excesses and the catastrophic impact they had on Rome. His reign was a fevered dream of delusions, spectacle, and violence that left the empire reeling in its wake. The people of Rome, once eager for change, found themselves living under a madman's rule, where fear and paranoia were the new normal. His assassination, though swift, was only a temporary reprieve. The empire was left to pick up the pieces of what had been a shattered and chaotic period. But even in his death, Caligula left behind a lesson that resonates to this day: that absolute power, without balance or restraint, is a dangerous thing. It's a lesson that history has learned time and again, from the fall of empires to the rise and fall of individual leaders. The danger of becoming so enamored with power, so blind to the needs of the people and the responsibilities of leadership, is that it can ultimately lead to the unraveling of everything you've built. In Caligula's case, that unraveling came quickly, but the impact of his reign, however brief, echoed through the halls of Roman power for years to come. Once again, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so we have more motivation to produce better quality products. And now, good night.